Hey guys, welcome back to another week of the Get to Know Me series. For being here today, That's right. It's another episode of Get to Know, brought to you here by the Salvation Army of Berwick. And today we have a guest that probably could be called out of this world. That's right. It's cliche. It's, you're going to hear, I can hear the groans, but it's all good. We have a great guest today joining us, Mr. Michael Oneal. He is a retired engineer from NASA, and he has got an amazing story, amazing background, and he wants to share that with us today. So let's get to know Mr. Michael Oneal. All right, let's bring him in right now. Mr. Oneal, welcome to the show. I almost forgot, NASA engineer, author, ministry director. You kind of got your hands in many, many pots in a good way.
Yeah, God's opened quite a few doors for me, Captain Mike.
Well, we're so glad that you are able to join us here. And I just want to let our viewers know if Mike sounds a little raspy, it's because he's just getting over a little bit of a cold there. So you have to forgive him a little bit. But we are so thankful that you were able to join us and that you're feeling well enough to do that. And so I just kind of want to start from a little bit of the beginning. NASA engineer, what in the world, no pun intended, does that mean?
Well, it could mean a lot of different things, but for me and where I was at the Kennedy Space Center, we're involved with taking like the space shuttle, and I was hired in right before the space shuttle Columbia was delivered to the Kennedy Space Center for the first time. But what we do is we take the vehicles, we basically do final assembly, test them, ready them for launch, and then launch them. Wow. And so that's what I was as an engineer. Typically that comes in a category of engineering they call test engineering. I did do a little software engineering in my career. I wrote some of the software that runs in the firing room that we use to test the shuttles. I actually worked on the space shuttle main engines, but that's kind of the engineering I did.
Wow. So talk about a vital job for sure, and hands-on. What year was the Columbia delivered there? What year did you start there?
So I started with NASA full-time in 1979. That's when it would have been delivered. I think it was in June of 79, if I remember correctly, but it was in 1979.
So seeing all those clips of the shuttles going off there at the beginning is almost like seeing your children out in the yard playing and having memories, Facebook memories for you. So I gotta, it's such a big job and very, very, for me, interesting. And for a lot of people, I've got to tell you, I've been hyping your interview for a while amongst the people here. And especially with, I got to share a quick side story. Mike gave me a call a couple of weeks ago, and when our secretary answered the phone, she said, who can I tell him's calling? And he said, oh, it's Mike, the rocket scientist. And I said, it's one of the few people in the world that can actually say that. So working on these shuttles and being in NASA and seeing all this space exploration, did you always have a passion for space and for travel and aviation and everything, or was this something that kind of came later in life?
That's a really good question. It's really a little hard for me to answer because when I first graduated high school, I mean, to be honest, um, sports were more the love of my life, and girls were right in there too. And I was very active with my church, but the former two, to be totally honest, probably had the most of my interest at the time.
Right.
When I actually put off a decision on where to go to school very late, and fortunately for me, um, it was called University of Central Florida at the time, was called Florida Technological University,
Mhm.
and it was still fairly new. Just like 2 months before the fall semester or quarters, we were on a quarter system. I applied to the school and got in. And I'll be totally honest, Captain Mike, I literally did not know what an engineer did.
Wow.
Um, I just knew they were good in math. I was good in math. And so I went in that direction. My dad was an engineer, but that had really little influence on what I did. I did. Being I grew up in Titusville, Florida, which is right across a river from the Kennedy Space Center. I had seen launches and stuff, and my dad worked in the space program, so it was kind of in my blood. Um, but it really didn't occur. I know I'm answering this in a roundabout way, but probably it didn't really hit me till I really saw that space shuttle Columbia. I
Right.
mean, then this passion for human space flight started growing in me, and obviously going through the Challenger accident, that changed my life. Period. And that passion got elevated to many, many, many more degrees. But when you kind of get going in the space program with what you do, I mean, those shuttles, they're $3.5 to $6 billion a piece,
Wow.
and you're flying humans in a very, very dangerous vehicle, and it's got hypergolic propellants, explosives on board, and so on, and you learn to take it very seriously what you're doing, and a lot of the people I worked with, and I think I could put myself in this vein, you kind of become a space program patriot.
Mm.
And so this passion, it just builds in you because of what you do and what you're trying to accomplish, and the many marvelous people that you work with and that you're putting into space.
Right. Yeah. The I never really thought about the scope of what you're responsible for in every aspect of touching those shuttles and preparing those. So, so you went to Florida Technical, now UCF. Um, what was the transition from college to NASA? Was that literally your first job out of school, or did you work your way up the ladder some way?
No, I actually, while I was at the University of Central Florida, I got into a co-op position when I was started my junior year in college. So I would go to school a quarter and I'd work for NASA a quarter.
Mm.
So I did that for 4 quarters, and that enabled me to, once I graduated, for NASA to hire me right out of college. Um, a lot of times, one of the problems with getting on board with NASA is the government just goes into hiring freezes a lot, and just
Right.
even if they want to hire you, they can't. But the co-op program was a way they could still bring people on board, and so that opened the door for me big time.
And so, as you transitioned into this position, basically working for NASA, interning in a sense throughout your college career, did you find that your schooling. I mean, I would imagine may sound like a dumb question, but in a position as an engineer at NASA, your schooling had to have played a huge role in your everyday life, right? Because I know a lot of us, we kind of go, I don't know if we're ever going to use this, but in your case, I think you had to.
Yeah, my schooling in general was, I did use it. Now, I wasn't a design engineer, so a lot of the things, except for some of the software, um, I didn't use a lot of my electronics design and stuff I learned. But the theory behind all that and understanding how the avionics system worked, and when we troubleshot issues and problems, that stuff came very, very handy. No way I could even come close to being able to do my job without that college education. One of the real interesting things too that I learned was, um, and especially when I got into management, that boy, your technical writing skills, your speech wound up being extremely important. Because I was just like with you today, I was talking over headsets in a firing room, so I needed to be somewhat eloquent, and being able to express myself and what was going on. And I did a lot of presentations. And the other thing that I found really interesting from an education standpoint, as I got into management, I took some graduate work in behavioral science, and I started understanding all these people around me better. Um, Engineers are a little bit more rational, reasoning, judge. I don't mean judgmental in a bad way, but
Right.
their approach to their psychological being, and just understanding things about the humans really helped me, and to be able to deal with people and situations with humans throughout my career.
Right. And yeah. And a lot of the people we've spoken with in all kinds of varying jobs, everything from video game writing to broadcasting, they said, the things that you didn't expect to be useful to learning were what was used, and time. You have to time yourself when you're a broadcaster, when you are even performing on, whatever performance may be. You need to be able to hit your cues. You need to know angles for camera cuts, so on and so forth. So yeah, having the writing makes a lot of sense in that. And so we've talked with our guest a lot about that the journey to get where they are now, and the struggles along the way sometimes that do inevitably come up. And you mentioned one right from the jump, and I was hoping to kind of go back to that. There's going to be a lot of kids and younger people here that may not be completely knowledgeable about the Challenger disaster, the Challenger explosion that happened. I remember it being very prevalent when I was in school, and us taking a lot of time learning about that. Could you maybe share that experience and kind of a little bit more? You briefly touched on what it meant to you and how you use that in your work.
Yeah, well, I had been up to the point of the Challenger launch. I was probably in either the launching firing room or the management firing room for about 75% of the launches.
Mhm.
For that Pacific launch, I actually came in for prior to the launch team, and I was involved with tanking the big external tank, which houses the liquid oxygen tank and liquid hydrogen tank. And so once we got those propellants loaded, I actually was relieved. So I wasn't there for that Pacific launch in the firing room, at least. But that Pacific morning was very, very cold. And in fact, we had even, because it looked like it was going to freeze through the night, they actually opened up some of the water drains on the launch pads to allow the water to flow out and go into the drains so the pipes wouldn't freeze and burst. Well, unfortunately, the drains actually froze over, and there was
Oh,
enough
wow.
winds that morning that the water went all over the place, and there were icicles hanging all over the launch pad. It weren't on the shuttle, but it was on the launch pad. So it
Right.
was a big concern that, when you first ignite those engines and then the solid rocket boosters, when you get all this vibroacoustic shock going on, that some of that ice could break loose, ricochet off the structure, and come back and hit the shuttle.
Mhm.
So that was a really big concern. And so some of those kind of things were having to be taken care of. There were other things that some of the mechanical and fluids people were working that morning because of the cold temperatures. But that's kind of was the biggest problem. As I remember all this, and if I'm mistaken, just for all I can ask is forgive me, because it's been a
Oh, yeah.
while.
Yeah.
But the temperatures when we actually launched got back up, I think, to back within what we called our launch commit criteria limits. But the actual joints of the solid rocket boosters were still a little colder than that. And the solid rockets on the side of those external orange tanks, they're made into segments. So there's multiple segments and they're stacked on each other. Well, between each segment, there's two big, giant rubber O-rings, if you will. And so when you ignite those solid rocket boosters, they hot gases can go into those joint areas, and the hot gas is supposed to be stopped by those rubber seals, and typically they are. Well, that morning, because it was so cold, that rubber got a little, if you will, a little brittle, a little.
Mhm.
It wasn't brittle's a wrong word. It wasn't as pliable as you would like them to be.
Right.
It was literally shot right around those O-rings and impinged right onto the external tank. And as they went up during ascent, and you basically had a jet of hot gases blowing into the external tank, it eventually ruptured the hydrogen tank, and then everything started coming apart and explosions happened. And I was actually, this was the first time this happened. I went to, it's kind of interesting here in Titusville where I live, because people come from, I mean, they come from all over the country to watch shuttle launch.
Right.
And
Yeah.
up and down our river, there's just tons of people watching. Well, if you wait till after the launch, I have to get to my home, I have to fight all that tourist crowd
Wow.
to be able to get home. So
Yeah.
this is the first time. I usually would watch the launch from out at the Kennedy Space Center, about 3.5 miles away. But this time I decided I'm going to go home, and I'd work totally through the night, and I was going to watch it on TV and then go outside and watch it from my front yard. And as I did, I remember thinking it was about time we went through that, where we throttle back as we go through what they call the maximum area of dynamic pressure. And it was about time to throttle up. And I was actually thinking about that. And then all of a sudden I saw this huge, immense cloud.
Mhm.
And I ran back inside, looked at the tracking cameras, and I even remember saying to myself out loud, where's the shuttle? Where's the orbiter? Where's the orbiter? And I could see that the solid rocket boosters, they were kind of aimlessly propelling themselves around the sky. We have when you jettison the solid rocket boosters, we have an abort mode that's called a return to launch site. Typical mission, you burn the engines for about 8.5 minutes. The solid rocket boosters are spent at 2 minutes. The engines keep firing for another 6 to take you up to orbit. And a return to launch site, those engines, and there's probably one that you've lost, the remaining ones burn for 12.5 minutes. And you're firing those engines, and the shuttle's flying basically upside down, and you're going down range. Eventually, the whole vehicle pitches itself around, and then boom, you're flying back to the Kennedy Space Center. And all the engines are firing, incidentally, not just the main engines at this point. We have orbiter maneuvering engines, all the reaction control jets that are aft firing. Everything's firing out of the aft of the vehicle. One of the reasons is mostly you're trying to get rid of all the propellants, because if you do have explosions, you don't want things, much stuff in the vehicle, as little as you can have in the vehicle as possible. But at 12.5 minutes, you basically jettison the tank, and then the orbiter just glides into the runway.
Okay.
So that was what I was hoping, that hoping beyond hope that abort mode was still intact and we could do it. And it didn't take me long to realize that, that wasn't going to happen. And I just immediately went and got in my car and went back out to the Kennedy Space Center, and went into the office areas where we worked. People had already made their way back from the firing rooms. And what what was interesting was, we had worked with those astronauts, and it's just unimaginable to think they weren't now with us.
Right.
And you've got, typically a lot of people will ask why, why did this happen? Well, that's not what's kind of going through your head. It's more like, did I do something that
Right.
contribute to such a horrible accident? And I had worked the space shuttle main engines, and if one of them came apart, obviously it could tear the vehicle apart. So, I was really, really concerned about that. And then the other thing was, you had on board that day, I don't know if you remember, we had the first Teacher in Space award recipient, Krista
Yeah.
McAuliffe.
Right.
So we had just probably hundreds of thousands of children watching around the nation watch this hero from the classroom die. And so, it was just a very heartrending thing to live through. And now it didn't take me long to realize, as I got looking at a lot of the data, that we were actually, the engines were responding to something external. We were going what's called LOX rich. So the engines were being starved of hydrogen. And so I was pretty sure that the engines didn't cause the accident. In fact, they were trying to shut down, but boy, you just couldn't shut them down fast enough. But it was a very tragic day, that's for sure.
Yeah, and to kind of just put this in perspective for those that are young enough, this happened. I want to make sure I get the day, January 28th of 1986, and yeah, this was back then. I was very young, but every shuttle launch back then, they would cut away, the midday talk shows or whatever, and they would show it on national television. It was an event, and this. So imagine everybody's watching at home. You're watching television. They cut away. This is, and you see literally this happen before you. So how did the follow up there? And these are important for us to think of when we kind of, the goal of this show is, following our passions that God has given us to go into careers. And sometimes we can romanticize that in our heads, thinking it's going to be the greatest thing ever. And it usually is, but that doesn't mean that struggles don't come. That doesn't mean that obstacles aren't there. How did you and your colleagues kind of rebound from this? And I don't want to say use this going forward, but how did it change your perspective in your everyday work life?
Well, I think that during pre-Challenger, I think the engineers I think we were vigilant, but it did start to become a little more commonplace. And so after that, to be honest, it just took your devotion level to what you were doing up several more notches, because it was hit home to you, the serious nature of your job and what you did. And so, yeah, that's probably kind of what happened there for me, at least. And just so you know too, is shuttle launches, as I would come into the firing room for a launch countdown, I would often see the shuttle sitting down there on the launch pad, and like 12 o'clock at night, and they'd be all lit up by xenon lights, and it just puts this real pure white light on that shuttle.
Wow.
And it looks, Captain Mike, kind of otherworldly, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
But that image for me became almost a sacred thing. It almost was like it was being beckoned to me to be especially vigilant in the coming hours, and a very prayerful thing. I would be driving in and see something similar, because I could see from where I drove through part of Kennedy Space Center swampland. So you can see the shuttle sitting on the launch pad in the distance, and you'd see those white lights on it. And I would just pray, on my way in. I didn't close my eyes, but you know how that
Yeah, right.
But I'm praying, but I never took for granted especially after Challenger, if you will. Never commonplace again is probably the better word, that what we were doing. And it was really elevated into how I just did my job and the devotion I put into it.
Yeah, and that's I it's safe to say that your example is probably one of the more, largest examples. But when we, I think you can agree, when we are in a career or in doing something God has called us to do, there are those moments where it recognizes that we have an impact. No matter what God has called us to do, we have an impact on other people's lives, and there is a level of preparedness you need to have, and there is a sanctity in that, in knowing that what you do, be it a writer, be it an entertainer, be it a video game designer, be it a NASA engineer, was going to touch somebody's life somehow, and you need to take that very, very seriously. And
Yeah. And if we just learn to approach our vocations with the idea of it being a ministry in some form or fashion, and that God could use us that way, in that doors open as well that you
that's
might
right.
not see otherwise.
That's very, and that's my father-in-law, who I want to give. I'll give a shout out to my father-in-law and my brother-in-law, Bob and Bob. They're very excited to see this interview. They're my brother-in-law Robert is a huge lover of all things NASA. But my father-in-law would always say, when God closes a door, or the world closes a door, God opens a window. You know.
Yeah.
And you need to be aware of that. Well, Mike, we are, believe it or not, quickly approaching our half hour mark. Do you think you're up to, because you have such an exciting story with your ministry in NASA that I would love to get to? Do you think we're feeling okay to come back for a round two?
I think we ought to go for it. I got enough water left. I think I can make it through it.
All right. Well, that's wonderful. So this is what we're going to do, folks. We're going to go ahead and end this interview for today right here on part one of this incredible story of Mike Oneal, engineer at NASA. And we're going to come back next week and tune in to hear not only about his interaction with the astronauts, but how God called him to a specific ministry towards those astronauts. And we'll hear about that and some of those amazing stories, as well as some of the amazing books he's written on the subjects. So, Mike, thank you so much for part one. Hang out. We'll come back for part two, and tune in next week. And remember, everybody, stay close to Jesus. We'll see you next week.
Amen.